Great Irish Potato Famine of 1847 brought many thousands of Irish to America.
Slavery brought hundreds of thousands of Africans to America.
The California Gold Rush and railroad expansion brought even more thousands of Chinese to America.
Discrimination and poverty brought thousands and thousands of Jews to America.
I think that most of the immigrants came over to escape bad living and working conditions.
But it must also have had to do with their hope for freedom and new opportunities.
Everybody in this country is either an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants, unless they are Native Americans.
Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Walt Whitman, American poet, 1855.
Hard times caused people all over the world to search for a better life.
You know, I don't understand all this talk about immigrants. America's a nation of immigrants. Nearly everyone who lives here came from somewhere else, even generations ago.
Yeah, and I mean, they all came for pretty much the same reasons. Most of North Carolina's earliest settlers came, either by boat or wagon train, looking for a better life than the one they'd had somewhere else.
Well, some had no choice. They were taken from their villages in Africa and made to go across the Atlantic Ocean.
But the immigration story we're telling is about Jewish people who wanted to come.
My father tried to smuggle himself into this country on a banana boat. You know, he paid someone, they said we could get you in, probably similar to the Mexican stories today. But they caught him in the United States getting off the boat. They sent him back to Guatemala.
At first, there were just a few Jews here in North Carolina, but in time, more and more came. They were outsiders, like every new immigrant group here. A lot of them were poor and didn't have much education. Some were devout, some wanted to leave their customs and beliefs behind. English was a new language for most of them. Today, Jews are still a minority, but they've really grown in numbers. Every Friday night and Saturday, Sabbath services like this one in Greensboro take place in synagogues and temples all across North Carolina. At Sabbath services, the rabbi reads from the Torah. He uses this pointer, called a yad. They light candles, and a Kiddush cup is used at the end of the service for reciting a blessing over the wine.
It's really interesting there are so many synagogues and temples today where Jews can practice their religion.
But it wasn't always that way.
The coast and rivers were swampy, and there were dense forests, which all made travel and trade difficult. It became known as the graveyard of the Atlantic because its sandbars and beaches were so dangerous. So North Carolina grew very slowly. Then a few traders, like Jewish Portuguese merchant named Aaron Lopez, saw a chance to begin trade along the Carolina coast.
The Jewish population was really small in colonial America. Some of the colonies didn't let them worship in public, but Carolina gave them religious freedom at first. After the American Revolution, North Carolina's first constitution said only Protestants could be lawmakers. Jacob Henry, who was the only Jewish member of the state legislature, defended his right to serve. His speech was an early milestone in the fight for religious freedom. Jews began migrating to America from Germany and other parts of Central Europe. They wanted the economic opportunity and religious freedom they didn't have where they came from. By the time the Civil War began, Jewish families had lived in North Carolina for decades, and now they felt loyal to the South. They'd had much more acceptance than their parents or grandparents had ever known in Europe. They joined their neighbors to fight for the South. Nice.
I look great. Leon enlisted, and he kept a diary. He wrote about mud, forced marches, and hunger. Once, he even had to buy a rat to eat. He admired General Robert E. Lee, who had let Jewish soldiers attend their High Holy Day services in Richmond, even when there was a battle going on. Later, Union soldiers caught Leon, and he spent the last year of the war as a prisoner until General Lee surrendered in April of 1865.
The German Jews kept coming after the Civil War, and hundreds more of them settled all over the state. Tenant farms began, worked by landless whites and freed slaves. They all needed supplies. Jews came, peddling.
They also liked to do things that were portable in early years because they were always being run away from somewhere, so if they could carry their trade on their back, they had a better chance of surviving.
Industrial mills had opened. Peddlers brought shoes and clothes to the workers and took the factory-made goods to farmers in the countryside. Life wasn't easy, but it was still better than it had been in Europe. Like most immigrants, they did anything they had to do to provide for their families.
Some made their living selling junk or scrap metal. I'll smash that.
I'll smash it.
But can you believe Max Samet used to travel the countryside in an old Model T around Mount Airy and collect old car batteries like this one and then bust them up to salvage the lead that was inside?
And the Gordons from Statesville were also recycling junk.
The Jews, for the most part, were peddlers and scrap dealers because they were excluded from many other trades. They weren't allowed to be in heavy industry or mining, and I suppose were discouraged from owning property in the early years. And they came from Europe, where they were discriminated against in the agricultural activities over there.
My father was 17 years old, and he decided he's going to go out on his own, so he came to Statesville. He found a little company here that used metal to melt to make machinery with. So Dad figured that'd be a good place to stop because he had some place to sell his scrap metal.
Some started farming. The Katzensteins in Warren Plains grew tobacco.
Our grandfather, Alex, who came, I think, at about the age of 17.
He had a horse and buggy, and he had an axe in the foot of the buggy. And the reason for that was on his trips to various farms where he would trade. Sometimes there were fallen trees. Out he would go with the axe, clear the path.
A younger family member, Selma Katzenstein, eventually ran the farm herself.
It was at a time when very few women were engaged in farming, and the tobacco warehouse was not a place for them to be, but she had to be there in order for the crops that she worked so hard on to be well sold.
The Cohns, sons of early German immigrants, were one of the most successful North Carolina Jewish families. At first, they peddled bolts of cloth, but eventually they built their own textile mill. They started in Greensboro, but became the biggest producers of textiles in the South. One of their products was denim, what was used to make heavy-duty overalls.
Denim like this. These are some magic jeans.
What my father used to call the goose that laid the golden egg was really White Oak Mill. It turned out to be their nice German Jewish guy in California who needed some material for the gold rush. They needed a tough, heavy-wearing but comfortable material to work as gold prospectors and work in the gold mines of California. This German Jewish guy was named Levi Strauss, and Cone Mills historically was the largest and the major supplier to Levi Strauss, and that's where the huge growth of Cone Mills came from.
Now pay attention, we're going back in time and somewhere else in the world.
By the late 1700s, the Russian government had forced all Russian Jews to move into an area called the Pale of Settlement. Few were allowed to go to universities and to hold certain jobs. Jewish boys as young as 8 were forced to join the Russian army for 25 years.
My father and mother would rarely talk about their experiences in Russia. In fact, my mother would always say, "You don't want to know about it." The Cossacks, the guys on the horses, they would come through the little shtetls and they would shoot up the people. The pogroms, they didn't want to talk about it.
So an even larger wave of Jewish immigrants left Russia, Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe to come here. Most came to ports all along the East Coast. The Jewish population grew from 820 Jews in 1878 to 6,000 by 1905.
Min Klein came to America from Lithuania as a young child. She wrote a book with her own memories of her family's first years in North Carolina.
In the pack of items which the tired peddler carried on his back, he packed a few slices of bread, hard-boiled eggs, possibly some cheese and an apple to keep him going during the days he would be out on the road. Sometimes he was taken in as a guest by a friendly farmer who wanted to see what a Jew looked like and how he talked. When the peddler had enough money to buy a horse and buggy, he felt he was on the way to having a business.
And of course, like most people, my father and my uncle peddled and try to save up enough money to open a store, to go in business.
A lot of shopkeepers' families lived in the back room of their stores until they could afford a house.
I was born in the Hayti section of Durham, in a little store in a black neighborhood. We lived in the back of the store. My mother would have a cow, chickens, and she would get milk, get eggs. It was a trying time, but we made it. We made it okay. Well, we didn't have anything.
Most of my memory is around the hub, our store. I was about 4 or 5 when that started, and then I started spending more time in there when I got 6 or 7. And my father passed away when I was like 12. My mother took over, and she did a good job. For some reason, I liked the bargain end of the business, and I asked her, could I open up a bargain basement? I was 16 years old in that store, and she said, sure. So we opened the bargain basement, and that little basement did a terrific job. And I opened up a store in Charlotte on Central Avenue called Family Dollar Stores, nothing over $2.
They must have been really successful. I see them everywhere I go.
Look what I just got. Imagine not being familiar with sliced bread or canned fruit.
You know, we really have a lot of stores in America. There are so many everyday things we take for granted here that I'm sure that these immigrants who came from such poor villages in Europe must have been amazed by.
Constantly, we were discovering things we never dreamed of, and my cousin Dora was my guide, showing off with great pride the American novelties, such as the beautiful white toilets in the girls' bathroom. We must have flushed hundreds of gallons of water just for the sheer pleasure of this wonderful apparatus. After a month in our new home, my father proudly escorted me to the only school in the town of Oxford. When my father finally released my shaking hand, he whispered, "No soldier will be watching you or trying to kidnap you. Just remember, this is America, and you are getting an education free."
Not only did Jewish immigrants want their children to get a good all-around education, they were very concerned about their spiritual and cultural education too. And this could be a real big challenge in those early days. Sometimes it meant an extra house guest, and I don't mean just for a few days either.
Our dad had to find a place for his 5 sons to be educated in Jewish life and in Hebrew. So he and our mother brought in a retired rabbi, and he lived with us. The house was between 2 streets. One yard we had a football field, on the other side we had a baseball field. So we played football or baseball, whatever the season was, and every kid in town was out there playing ball, and the window would raise up upstairs in the bedroom, and the rabbi would stick his head out. He said, "Come, Tzala, it's your turn for the Hebrew lesson." And I said, "No way." And I'd start continuing to play ball. But he finally got it done, though.
At first, early Jewish families held their religious services in their shops or their homes. Sometimes, Jewish immigrants had carried a Torah all the way from their villages in Europe. They displayed them in their own homes until they built synagogues. In towns with only a few Jewish families, parents would drive their kids 10 or 20 miles to the nearest city. Check this out. In the 1950s, Jewish families solved the problem of living in places too small to have a rabbi. They hired a circuit-riding rabbi who traveled around in a bus. This rabbi would hold Bible classes, give Hebrew lessons, and lead services like Passover Seders. Is it lunchtime already?
Yep, we're keeping kosher.
It doesn't look any different from other food.
Well, no, kosher means that the food was prepared to a trained rabbi's specifications.
The shochet came to one place, and you had to go there with the chicken. I walked that street many a day with Mama to get those chickens killed. Then she'd bring it home and flick it dry.
Flick the chicken.
But it was a kosher home. and that chicken was kosher.
It was quite a task to have kosher food in a home in North Carolina because the kosher meat had to be brought in either from Baltimore or ordered from Charlotte, sent up from Charlotte where they had a kosher butcher.
Until a congregation was established in Oxford, we traveled 30 miles to spend the Jewish holidays with friends. This meant traveling by horse and buggy on dirt country roads with no maps to guide us, and took most of the day. It meant packing our own dishes, food, candles, and remaining with the friends who shared their small home with us until the day after the holiday.
Families gather for major Jewish holidays all year, and food is a big part of every holiday. In the fall, synagogues fill up for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In December, Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. In spring, it's Passover, the holiday that celebrates the freeing of the Jews as slaves and their exodus led by Moses. At this meal, Jews eat special foods that remind them of that event.
Seder means order. It's Hebrew for order, and it's the order of the story of Passover, which is the exodus of Jews from Egypt. And this is a Haggadah, the book that we read that tells the story of the Exodus. Every Jew feels like they were a slave in Egypt. Here's a roasted egg, and it's a symbol for the springtime, as is parsley. And we take the parsley and we dip a piece in the salt water and we pass it, and everyone has that. So that they know, even as you have renewal and you have spring, you still have to remember that times were hard.
Jews faced hard choices, like all new immigrants to this country. They wanted to hold on to their traditional way of life, but they also wanted to fit into the American way of life. Though some families didn't keep kosher anymore or close their stores on Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath was and still is an important part of their week. It is a day of worship and rest. It begins at sundown on Friday night and ends at sundown on Saturday.
We had to stay open on Saturday because the country people would come to town, the farmers would come in, and they would need things. They didn't come in much during the week. Back then, we used to stay open on a Saturday till 11 o'clock at night.
American Jews almost never experienced the kind of horrible persecution German and Eastern European Jews had, but at times there was more personal prejudice. Sometimes they were excluded.
I was always a minority. A lot of the kids, let's say they belonged to clubs or what have you. There were no Jews allowed in clubs. Very conscious of that. Even city clubs, business clubs.
My freshman year, I had a girl that was in my dormitory come up to me and tell me that she knew I was Jewish, and she just was very curious to know if I had horns. And I had never heard that before. And I was really stunned. And I said, well, why are you asking me that? And she said, well, I was taught that as a child, that Jews had horns. And I said, well, you're welcome to check my head. I don't think I have any.
But people also shared their culture and showed respect for their beliefs and practices.
In the South, religion is so central to people's lives. People really love their faith, and people respect those who are of the Jewish faith. They'll ask, what church do you go to? And if you say you go to a synagogue, they'll say, that's great. You go to a Jewish church as long as you are going to church. So I find people really want to know and learn, and they try to understand our different beliefs.
One time when we were going to Raleigh for services for Rosh Hashanah, and we're driving over there with our two daughters and my son, and we're listening to the high school football game. And at halftime, the announcer on the radio also got on the public address system, and he said, I guess you see that Deborah Fox, who's a cheerleader, is not with us today, and Susan Fox, who's head of the reception committee for the visiting team, they're not with us. They have to be in Raleigh for a Jewish holiday. Let's give 'em a cheer. Now y'all all repeat after me. Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah. And sure enough, the whole crowd is cheering, and they got a big kick out of it. They loved it.
By the 1970s, North Carolina and the South were changing fast. Geographers named these fast-growing southern states the Sun Belt. Thousands of businesses and families moved down from northern states. They wanted milder winters, lower energy costs, lower taxes, and non-union jobs. This was good news for some in big cities and bad news for others. Small towns shrank and downtown Jewish stores closed.
They slowly drifted away because the merchants were not there anymore. The merchants, they educated their children in the small towns, and the children didn't want to stay in the small towns, and they came to the larger cities.
And that story of fathers who built businesses for their sons who didn't want them is a paradigmatic story of growing up Jewish in the South.
But Jewish populations have grown in bigger cities like Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, and Asheville. New synagogues opened and congregations have formed in bigger towns all over the state. In earlier times, North Carolina welcomed Jewish peddlers and merchants. Now there are Jewish doctors, scientists, inventors, and entrepreneurs. One of these inventors was Joe Woodland, who moved to North Carolina in 1971 to work for IBM Computers in the Research Triangle Park. He invented the barcode, or UPC.
Some Jews give back to their larger communities by getting involved, like serving on school boards, city councils, or county commissions. And dozens have been elected mayors or members of North Carolina's legislature. Jewish North Carolinians have also given back to their communities through philanthropy, something expected of all Jews, to give to charities, help build a new hospital, a library, a youth center, and more.
I've always been very aware of what, for example, my generation's been given. My grandparents did come over here with absolutely nothing. They had endured very hard times, but they really became very successful in what they did and were able to, to grow a business, which then enabled them to be very much a part of their community. So I think that that's what's come down to us, and what our job is to leave that legacy for our children.
North Carolina Jewish communities have also given back by welcoming new immigrants. Some were fleeing oppression that took place elsewhere in the world in the 20th century. The takeover of the Cuban government by Fidel Castro forced many Jews who had come to Cuba to escape persecution in Europe to leave again. Some came to North Carolina.
That helped us.
Sure.
And especially when you have to run twice and start business twice, and that, like my husband or your father, father, it was hard for them to leave. Come to Cuba, start a business, somebody with no reason takes it away from you, and then you come here and you have to again gain confidence from other people to start your new life again.
Right, and no language.
And no language.
It was really important to me to become a citizen in this country. And one of the main things was that I really wanted the right to vote. I grew up in Brazil, under a military dictatorship my entire life in Brazil. And so we weren't really afforded that right. Of course, it took me years to become a citizen here. And so this was a really moving experience for me, I remember. Everybody's kind of a little bit nervous and a little bit excited. And the incredible array of countries that were represented, people from Korea and from China, and Venezuela and Colombia and Mexico, and you name it. It was just like the beautiful rainbow of people.
The history of Jewish life in North Carolina is part of an age-old pattern. Like most immigrant groups, Jews left their homelands for the promise of a better life. They faced the challenges of earning a living, learning a new language, and understanding unfamiliar customs and practices. They worked to fit in and become active members of their communities, while holding on to their own beliefs and practices in this nation of nations. Over time, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these immigrants, proud of their heritage and grateful to their state, found many ways to give back. Respect, tolerance, and acceptance have made the Jews of North Carolina happy to call this state their home.
y'all all repeat after me. Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah. And sure enough, the whole crowd is cheering, and they got a big kick out of it. They loved it. They loved the idea that they cared about them, they missed them, and they showed respect for their holiday.